Imagine this. You have to build the world's very first civilization. But there's a catch. The land you're building on can give you everything you need to flourish, but it could also just wipe you out in an instant, without any warning. Well, that was the reality for humanity's first civilization, born right there in the dangerous, fertile plains of Mesopotamia.
So let's really think about that. What would you do? How would you even begin to build a city from the ground up, with no blueprint, no instruction manual, especially when that very ground is both your greatest blessing and your most terrifying curse? This wasn't some thought experiment for the ancient people of Mesopotamia. This was the challenge that defined their entire existence.
Okay, so our story starts in a place called Mesopotamia, and that name is a huge clue because it literally means the land between the rivers. And that's not just some boring geographical label. Those two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, they are the key to this whole story. To really get a handle on Mesopotamia, you kind of have to zoom out of it. See, it's sitting right in the heart of this much larger region known as the Fertile Crescent. It's this beautiful arc of incredibly rich soil that became, well, the perfect incubator for farming and eventually for civilization itself. And this brings us right to the central drama of life in Mesopotamia, those two massive rivers. You know, the Tigris and the Euphrates were a total paradox. On the one hand, they were the source of all life, but on the other, they were these bringers of sudden, terrifying death.
So let's break that down. First, the gift. Every single year, the rivers would flood, and they'd leave behind tons of this rich, dark topsoil that made farming a breeze. They give you fresh water, fish to eat, clay to build your houses, reeds to make your boats. I mean, everything you needed to prosper. But then, there was the curse. The floods were just wildly unpredictable. A giant wall of water could just rush down without warning, sweeping away your home, your crops, your family, everything. It was this constant, brutal cycle of creation and destruction.
So how do you survive in a place like that, let alone thrive? Well, you get really, really good at farming. And that incredible success is what led to one of the biggest leaps in all of human history, the invention of the city. And right here, around 3500 BC, this is where everything changes. For the first time ever, people could grow a surplus of food, way more than they needed just to get by. That surplus was the absolute key. It meant not everyone had to be a farmer anymore. People were freed up to become artisans, priests, soldiers. And that specialization, that's what gave birth to the world's very first cities, right there in a region called Sumer.
Now, these weren't cities like we think of them today, as part of a bigger country. No, each one was a city-state. Just think of it like a tiny, independent country. The city of Ur, for example, had its own king, its own government, even its own special god that protected it. It was completely separate from its neighbor, the city of Kish.
So what would it actually feel like to walk around in one of these places? Just picture it. You're in a public square and it's just buzzing with activity. You've got merchants shouting, trying to sell their goods from little stalls. You've got musicians and acrobats drawing crowds. And over in a corner, you might see a scribe, a professional writer, offering to write a letter for you, for a small fee, of course. This was a living, breathing, totally new kind of human experiment.
But then you'd go home and life was totally different. It was a retreat from that chaos. Houses were built around these private inner courtyards, which became these little sanctuaries for families to eat and for kids to play. And get this, the most ingenious part? On those brutally hot nights, pretty much the whole city would drag their beds up onto the flat rooftops to sleep under the stars and escape the heat. Pretty smart, huh?
I mentioned scribes a second ago, and it's really hard to overstate how important these guys were. I mean, once you have cities, you've got taxes, you've got laws, you have trade deals. How do you possibly keep track of all that? You need professional writers. Scribes were basically the operating system for this new urban world. They kept all the records for the kings and priests, which made them incredibly powerful figures in Sumerian society.
But wow, becoming a scribe was no walk in the park. Just listen to this complaint from a Sumerian student, written down over 4,000 years ago. Doesn't that sound surprisingly familiar? Getting in trouble for sloppy homework, getting yelled at for talking in class. It's such a human moment, a powerful reminder that these were real people with frustrations just like ours.
So if you're living in this world of wild, unpredictable floods and at the same time amazing abundance, how do you make sense of it all? Well, you look to the heavens. The Sumerians developed this really complex religion that perfectly mirrored the chaotic, two-sided nature of their environment. And right at the physical and spiritual heart of every single one of their cities stood a ziggurat. And these things weren't just buildings, they were enormous, terraced pyramids, some of them 7 stories high.
The Sumerians believed they were literal stairways to heaven, a way for the gods to travel down to earth. It was the center of their entire world.
You see, their religion was polytheistic. They believed in many gods, and these gods were just as moody and unpredictable as the rivers. Their myths were basically warnings. If you anger the gods, you might get a catastrophic flood. But if you serve them well, bring them offerings, maybe you'll be rewarded with a great harvest. This whole worldview meant that the priests, the people who could supposedly talk to the gods, held an immense amount of power.
But, as you might have guessed, the story of Sumer doesn't exactly have a happy ending. In fact, the very success that came from taming those rivers and building these incredible cities, well, that success also carried the seeds of their own destruction.
And here is the great, tragic irony of Sumer's story. The very thing that was their source of power, being this collection of rich, fiercely independent city-states, that was also their fatal flaw. Their independence meant they could never truly unite, and all that wealth, it just made them a really tempting target for anybody with an army.
So instead of banding together against outside threats, they just turned on each other. These city-states started fighting these brutal wars over the very things that made them rich in the first place, the best land and, most critically, control over the river water. All this constant infighting just weakened everybody, leaving the entire region exposed and vulnerable.
And you can see exactly how it all played out. Around 2300 BC, an outsider, King Sargon, rolls in and conquers them all, uniting them for about a century. But that unity didn't last. It all dissolved back into squabbling city-states. And then, by the 1700s BC, the final blow came when their northern rival, Babylonia, swept in and took over, bringing the incredible era of the Sumerian civilization to a close.
So what are we left with? It's this powerful, timeless lesson from the dust of history. Sumer's greatest gift, its incredible wealth and resources, ultimately became the curse that destroyed it. And it really forces us to ask a tough question. Are our own modern civilizations any different? Are our greatest achievements, our technology, our global economy, also our greatest vulnerabilities? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.